welcome everybody. Very excited to have everybody here to talk about the world. Modest little topic, but here we are. In a time of turbulence and uncertainty across the world, be it turmoil in the markets, the fight for Ukraine, the aftermath of the pandemic. By the time we leave this tent, we'll probably have another chancellor. It is history that gives us perspective, context, and the means to understand. At Clifton, we're very proud to have gathered these preeminent speakers, arbiters of world history. Peter Frankopan is Professor of Global History at Oxford and Stavros Niarchos Foundation Director of the Oxford Centre for Byzantine Research, and a multi-best-selling author of his dazzling Silk Roads and the New Silk Roads. Ben Okri, Booker Prize-winning novelist who is also poet, essayist, short story writer, playwright, script writer, and he's also written about African history. Aindrea Emelife, art historian and curator. Her first book, A Brief History of Protest Art, was published in March this year, and this month she's contributed to revisiting modern art. Her wonderful exhibition, Black Venus, is about to go on tour, and her next book, based on the show, is a survey of black women through history and visual culture. And Simon Sebag Montefiore, my wonderful co-vice president of the Literary Festival, multi-prize-winning TV presenting author whose books have been translated into 48 languages. Jerusalem has sold over 1 million copies, and we are here to launch his lockdown project. It's not really, he just says that to make the rest of us feel bad, but which is The World, A Family History. Those who've read it are already raving about it. It's a staggering achievement. Montefiore has given us a tremendous gift, a pulsingly readable world history through the millennia and from one end of the globe to the other, says Simon Sharma. A tour de force, says Peter Frankopan. Magisterial, says Ben Okri. Okay.
You see why everybody's here
so
now.
feel good. Yes, exactly. But before we start, Ben is going to read us a poem.
It's a poem from my most recent book of essays, and it's called Finding the Present, an Extract. I can't read poetry sitting down, so. The present moment began with fire, and still it burns. It began with water, and still they drown on the margins of Europe. It began with air. See how they flee. See how the bombs fall on houses made of sand, dreams made of flesh, the blind drones of remote war. But it began with earth, where all destinies are one. But many perish for want of justice, or soap, or flowers, instead of fears. Our age is confused. The world runs ahead while humanity falls behind, trampled on by juggernauts whose names are the fearsome powers. You know what I'm talking about. Across borders and nations, a new web of chains within the greatest horizon the world has ever known. Water itself resists oppression. Press her down too much and she erupts with unexpected force somewhere else. We're all on a great ship that's lost its balance, lost its way. And a huge storm is gathering beyond the iron veil of our hearts. Maybe it is a storm of truth. Maybe it's a storm of revelation, of which art is the unknown magus. The age is changing. The present moment is itself constantly revealing. Everything we see is a mask of time concealing its features. Come with us through the mask into the rights of vision and truth. Come with us into the blue garden. New time is being made here from the wandering sleep of dreamers. Shadows on the cave walls walk to and fro. Shadows on the city walls come and go. Shadows in the garden, shadows in the garden, shadows in the shadows.
Brilliant. It's all there. Beautiful.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really wonderful. What a beginning. So, Sebag's book, we've got a lot of ground to cover. He starts with a family walking on a beach 950,000 years ago, and he ends with the invasion of Ukraine and the technology that shapes us. So, to that end, I'm going to shamelessly jump around. I've got questions with a sort of lead person, but anybody who wants to jump in when they can or not. We're very excited to have the actual book here. We nearly had a total crisis. There were sort of couriers coming through the night because we couldn't actually get it delivered. There was a paper crisis. So on which note I want to start, really? Peter Frankopan. Okay, globalization. We can't even get a book to Clifton without it being a huge crisis. Is it over?
Gosh. Well, first of all, thank you, Catherine and Sebag and all the arrangers. I mean, it's such a fantastic, we're so fantastic to be out in the wild and on such a fantastic panel with so many different insights we're going to have. And also, this is the first time I've seen your book, Sebag, and probably first or second time you've seen it.
I've only just seen it today.
There you go.
Yeah, so it is the first time I've seen it.
So is
Great
globalization over? I'll do a sort of quick answer, and the answer is absolutely not. I don't mean that because I believe in globalization or globalization is a good thing, but although I'm a historian and we think of ourselves as being different to scientists, I want to measure things. And in terms of intensifications of international and global trade, the numbers are going up. We in Britain and in Europe are at the wrong end of some of those discussions, but amazingly, 95% of the world's population don't live in Europe. And for them, intensifications of trade and trade relationships is the theme of the last 3 or 4 years. It's accelerated through COVID.
Okay, all right.
Is that okay?
Yes. Okay. Well, we'll buy that.
Yeah.
Sebag.
Well, I just want to say also, I mean, just sort of slight welcome to everybody here at Clifton, and also, yes, what a relief they galloped through the night with that book, and it just arrived in time. So I'm so pleased to have it here, and I just see it with. It's such an exciting thing to actually see, as everyone on this panel knows. The moment when the actual book turns up and it's kind of all there is a great joy. But I also say it's not a coincidence that we're all here, because this is a very global book. All of you are experts on different parts of the world, and the Silk Roads. Ben and Peter have been kind of great inspirers of this book through their works. Your article in African History in The Guardian, the Silk Roads, and of course there's a lot of Africa and a lot of women in the book. And that's the great thing about family history. The concept of this book is that, I love global history, I love world history and its incredible span, its economics, its statistics. I also love biography, the intimacy, the grit of life. And the reason I came up with the idea of a family history is as a useful focus that allows you to look at all parts of human life with the one thing we have in common. And it's a way to combine the span of world history with that intimacy of daily life. And so that's the moving spirit of this book, and that's why it's called A Family History. And that's why, in a sense, having this group of great novelists, great historians on this panel reflects the nature of this crazy endeavor that I did do in lockdown, a little lockdown book, let's put it like that.
When you say family, are you talking about the nuclear family, dynasties, tribes? What kind of family have you got in mind?
It's both. It's both. I mean, obviously, the great thing that the family that we all have in common is the nuclear family, mum and dad, children, and the book covers that. But also the best preserved families, the families with the best records are, of course, ruling families. But it's not just about kings and dynasties, though they're all there. It's also about families of historians, in fact, families of writers, families of doctors, families of generals, all of whom play key roles in the book. So it's both. But of course, dynasties are particularly fascinating. And one of the things I wanted to do was, traditionally, when people talked about dynasties, they talked about the Habsburgs or the Romanovs or the House of Windsor. And what I wanted to do is look at the families that made history right up to 2023, 2022, the families that made history also in Asia, in Africa, and to treat those dynasties, whether they're Dahomey or Benin, Cambodia, Hawaii, exactly as I would treat the Habsburgs or the Saxe-Coburgs. And so that's the other moving spirit of the book.
It is without doubt the most diverse history book I have ever seen. And I'm very interested, you mentioned earlier that families gives you the chance to include women in history and, you know, the whole world. Aindrea, African women hold a particular place in African history, don't they? And Sebag has been talking about how they can be matriarchs and they can be very strong. And you come with another perspective. Would you talk to me a little bit about what your sort of findings are when we're talking about...
Well, there's sort of a few threads that I've kind of been coming across and sort of investigating the role of women in African history, but also just in general, Black women in visual culture. So the show I did was looking at across a wide sort of visual culture and understanding the place of Black women in general. But in other projects that I've started to embark on, which are more particular to where I'm from as a Nigerian diaspora, I've started to investigate many other different stories, like Queen Mother Idia, who was one of the first, the first Iyoba of Benin, and that story and how that sort of lingers in Nigerian history and also in Nigerian contemporary culture. Because I would be told about Idia when I was a young girl, and as somebody to look up to, as a symbol of piety, of strength, because she basically helped her son, who was going to be the next Oba of Benin, to secure that role. And so she's a strong woman who was, she fought in that war, and then also, had the great prowess of political power, but also medicine. And so you have these matriarchal sort of symbols as a woman, but it still is a very patriarchal society. So there's like a two-sided coin, which is very interesting to try and understand how we sit in that culture and how that sort of leaks in different ways and how you sort of wrestle with those things as well.
Sure.
I mean, can I just interrupt? Because
course.
one of the great themes of the book is, of course, in dynasties, by their nature, women become very prominent as the mothers of kings, the protectors of their sons who are princes, and as a result, you have the strange conundrum that in these early modern dynasties, women are much more important than they later became in the Western world that prided itself on being more civilized, more open, more inclusive. And so you look at, but one of the most fascinating things is the stories of the women who started as enslaved women. In the Ottoman Empire, many of the queen mothers, the Valide sultans, started off as Christian women stolen from Ukrainian villages, Bosnian villages, Albanian villages, and taken to Istanbul to serve in the harem of the Sultan, where they were converted to Islam. And two of the key women in the book, one was known as Roxolana, but is also known as Haram Sultan, who married Suleiman the Magnificent and was the mother of his successor. And also, the most fascinating of all was Kosem, the queen mother, who really dominated in the early part of the 17th century, who dominated sort of 30 or 40 years of the Ottoman Empire. And it's fascinating, she started off as an enslaved woman and ended up as the empress of one of the greatest empires.
But there's also the quiet power of women.
Of course.
Yeah, I'm thinking of modern Africa, for example. Nkrumah, independence in Ghana. Nkrumah came to power not on the general popular vote, as we anonymously claim it. He came to power on the vote of women. He went to the market. It was the market women of Accra and Ghana that created the whole movement that changed African history. So there's that quiet, undocumented power as well, which I think is one thing that is often missing from history, because there's no obvious documentation of it. But yet, I mean, another great example is the economic revolution that was taking place, that's been taking place in East Africa, the way in which money exchange, that happened with women. That's women, market women. They sort of brought about a whole new economic system. That's undocumented. Yeah. So I'm also fascinated by that undocumented aspect of
which brings me very neatly to my next question, Ben, which is, history is incredibly, important, and you write about dynasties in fiction as well. What's a better way of telling history, or what's the difference? Do we do it through fiction, or through poetry, or through what does fiction and what does art bring us?
I've got two responses to
Yes.
this. The classical response is Tolstoy's skepticism of history as science. And it's a very, very powerful argument that's not really been properly answered. And his point is this. We have this whole idea that history is made by great individuals, great families, and he talks about the Napoleonic Wars, and we talk about the wars that are named after great individuals and great families. And he said, but actually, he says, I've been in a war, and I can tell you that half the time, the general over there giving instructions about the movement of troops over there, he doesn't know what's happening.
Yeah.
He says, he gives the instruction, but half the troop go there, one half stop to take a piss, another half, they don't know what's happening. And it's that all the stuff that falls in between the cracks of life that he, as a novelist, is interested in. That too is history. And I think it's a very, very, very powerful point. And it therefore leads to the whole aspect of the novelist being interested in the minutiae of what we call history, the day-to-day, even the subconscious dimensions of history. History as consciousness, the individual, the undocumented, the small, the tiny, the way in which big decisions are made, but actually they have unforeseen consequences. People thought Brexit was going to be a great idea, but nobody's talking about what a disaster it actually quietly is. History surprises us. So what is the best way to document history? I think exactly what Simon is doing, but also the songs of the people. The history, children's songs conceal so much history. I think our ancestors were very wise when they wanted to convey history, to catch the aspects of history that historians might not catch. They tuck them away in songs. The ancient Greeks believed very much that myths and legends were great places to conceal the truth of what the people went through. Very different from what Homer might tell us, or what the great historians like Herodotus might tell us. Rumors are a great point. Rumors are just as important.
Lies.
Lies are just as important.
Lies and myths. Yeah.
Oral history, the history that we tell in pubs, the history of the griots in Africa who tell the stories of families, and when they're subversive, they tell the stories of what the families did not know about that happened in the land. So there's subversive griots, which I am a proud member of, and then the official griots. So all the overground and underground ways of telling stories, I think we should actually now gather to revolutionize the way we can tell this rich, complex, and impossible story that is humanity.
It is impossible.
Amazing. And Andrea, there's also art, visual art. I mean, I know your wonderful exhibition, you've got pictures that tell their own story. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's not all words, is it? Sometimes an image.
It's funny because usually,
words.
because I'm a historian and a curator, I would say that art is probably one of the best ways to tell a story and to tell history.
Yeah.
But I was actually thinking about this just before this talk, how would this book, I haven't read all of it or any of it really, but thinking about the concepts, how would it work as an exhibition? And it wouldn't. And the problem is because encyclopedic museums, an 18th century model, cannot contain all of these narratives and be conscious in understanding the subjectivity of history. And so it works as a literary object because it's understanding, the linear sort of perspectives that can only be really sort of championed as a book. But as an artistic model, it would be very difficult because it will then have to encompass what I would think would be an act of cultural violence by having all of these objects in one space. So I think using and sort of telling these stories and living it through text is one of the best ways to, live those ideas.
Very good. So the world, irreplaceable. Sebag, you've written a lot about fiction. You've got Balzac, Dumas, the Dumas family, Le Carré. What's the function of creativity within the world?
Well, I think I agree with both Andrea and Ben, because one of the reasons I've done this through family is because it does contain the quiet times, the spoken, the family myth, the spoken the stories that are passed down through generations. That's part of it. But of course, it also contains creative people. And we mentioned Tolstoy. I mean, he's a character, but so is Balzac. These people all reflect fascinating aspects of history being moved forward, as does rock music, for that matter. And we've got the Stones in here. We've got music, which is a huge part of it. We've got Beethoven. The creation of the romantic world. So I think history has many levels, and one of the things I'm trying to do in this is we've got to appreciate history itself is not quite a science. We present it as a science. When people grab history, as President Putin has recently, and present a dogmatic, distorted version of what they think history is, many of their people may agree with them. But actually, we've got to think about history slightly differently and more realistically. History isn't just a science. It's a strange mixture of ethics, of myth, of story,
of lies,
of many lies, and lies that could be corrected. And of course, I think we've got to understand that history is pretty subjective. We've got to fight against its subjectivity. Peter, I'd love to ask you about that, because as someone who's actually teaching, a professor as well, history. I mean, one's got to try and get a grasp of the idea that history isn't purely objective and isn't purely science.
No, I mean, I think
we'd like it to be.
Yeah, I think that to be fair, we're living in something of a golden age of modern history now, of the understanding that we need to be much more diverse, we need to be regionally spread out, we need to think about things from bottom up as well as top down, or in fact, and at lateral levels too. And I think that there are lots of colleagues of ours who are doing fantastic work, and unfortunately they can't all come to Cliveden. But there is an enormous amount of vibrancy in the field of modern history at the moment. I mean, modern in the kind of Oxford sense of 4th century AD onwards, rather than the contemporary world. I think what's interesting is when I was a young graduate student, the things that we were taught to learn as to be a good historian were languages, to be able to engage with different sources. And that's a real critical problem we have in this country today, is the lack of language learning. So today in the UK, there are about 800 students in total studying combined Chinese, Russian, Arabic, Japanese, Korean, Khmer, Turkish, Farsi, most of which you can't study at most universities anyway. So it means our engagement is all very Anglophone, right? Even if we're looking at other parts of the world, it's through translations and in ways that are very unscientific because we're cherry-picking bits of texts. So those skills were important when I was a graduate student, about language and archaeology, material culture and art. And that was kind of it. Today, graduate students in history need to understand statistical sciences and maths. They need to understand genetics. They need to understand complex sciences, evolutionary biology, stuff that working on in Central Asia on one particular dig. There's a lot of isotope analysis, so you can see where people are moving, what are they eating, how do their diets change. I'm involved with a project in Bristol where we're looking literally at the shit. It's shit science of looking at where sailors came in and defecated, and there's sort of solid layers where you can see parasite reproduction. You can see what people are eating and how diets are changing, and seeing what kind of diseases they're picking up. And so today the challenge for a historian is to bridge those gaps, not just to think of history in a more scientific way, which everybody tries to be objective. It's rare you get Putins. Most people are trying to tell things in the kind of way. That's propaganda, and politics is a different story. We heard that in the last session with Andrew Roberts and Lord Roberts and Michael Gove, soon to be Lord Gove, probably. It's only because he misidentified me at the back of the hall, so so I think historians try to be objective. Historians try and tell a story, but now it's how do we embed those sciences and how do we train and pay for young people to acquire those kinds of skills. And there are lots of different ways in which education systems go right and wrong, but it just so happens here in the UK, you choose at 16 which subjects you work on. And most people either choose a science route or they choose a humanities route. And actually to do what we do and to talk properly about history, it's about evaluating evidence in a scientific way. And good judgment takes you a long way down those roads, as all of you do yourselves, and how you think about the world, how you try to be balanced. But actually bringing in scientific materials, climate resources, climate data, of which there are huge archives opening up, is what's really moving the field of history as a whole forward. So I think that there are all sorts of ways in which that then makes you more quantitative in how you think about narrative sources, because you can bolster arguments with vast amounts of data rather than highly subjective tools where you feel about kinship relationships or family or observations and so on. And if you come back to me, because I spoke for a little bit too long, I'd be great to talk about the role of gender over history and of civilization and urbanization in particular, because that has a hugely important role, I think, in how we commemorate what we think about in history.
Yeah, no, sure. Well, you did mention Putin, and I did want to ask you too about that, because you know, as you write very movingly in your conclusion, you say we can't understand the past, but history only goes so far. We need it to understand the present, and that's what we're concerned with as well. So let's just go for it. Are we looking for an imminent nuclear war? And are we? And can we survive a tactical strike in Ukraine? And I'm going to come to you on this as well.
I mean, I do think. I mean, this is a strange thing to say for someone who's just to a room full of history fans with a panel of historians, but you can have too much history. And I think that what really matters in life and in human, in politics, is how people want to live now. And, I mean, Putin is an example. Putin is, as Peter says, an extreme example of the abuse of history and the excusing of sort of present-day politics using history. And actually what really matters is not what date in the 18th century or the 17th century the Russians annex which part of Ukraine and what right that gives them today. But to me what matters is, what do the Ukrainian people now want to, how do they want to live now? How do they want to live for their families now? And that's what matters much more, that's much more important than the history. And so I think that's the sort of key lesson of Ukraine now. And as for the nuclear question, I mean, there are I think there are 8 or 9 nuclear powers now with nuclear weapons fully developed. But I think there are about sort of 40 states with nuclear programs, I think is about right. And all of them could, in theory, get nuclear weapons within quite a short time. So that though we could like to think of the world as like a very, proliferation, we've managed to restrain proliferation quite effectively. Actually, it could easily be clicked forward very fast. And we could end up with a much more nuclear world. And the trouble with weapons is, in the end, someone's going to want to use them if you have them. And I think it's quite a depressing thought, but tactical nuclear weapon may be used one day, by someone, and because they're available and more available around the world. So I think that's the way, any way we could look at it.
Can I move this discussion a little sideways and bring in an element which I think is germane to this, but again in a tangential way, which is something we're dealing with very much in our time. Again, belongs to the undocumented. Belongs even to the realm that you might call emotion. This new thing which is driving modern history, driving this nuclear threat that you're talking about, and that is false nostalgia. This sense of people who have this idea of a myth of who they used to be that they want to go back to now. And we're not looking at that. But it's driving the narrative of the world right now, in a way.
I think that's what we mean when we talk about history being used by politicians today to justify things.
Are you thinking about Putin?
Yeah,
I'm thinking about Putin. I'm thinking about many of the states in Eastern Europe. I'm thinking about Britain and Brexit. I'm thinking about many African states. False nostalgia. In Southern Africa, we used to be this kind of people, so this is what we're going to do. And it's driving our narrative.
And it's all invented.
And it's all invented. And Putin and Trump are two of the greatest exponents of this in our time. And I just wondered how you respond. How does history respond to something which does not exist, but which is being used to drive with that which will affect our futures?
Well, that's why we all write history, actually. Is we all write history in order to confront those myths, those lies. I mean, that's what our books, our sort of our dream is to actually sort of show people what really happened as close as we can.
Can you relate to this idea of false nostalgia or kind of?
Yeah, I'd probably throw a little bit of sort of lukewarm water and say, the Tudors weren't doing anything different, right? That's what history, how it always gets written. Thucydides was doing the same thing. You say you're trying to be objective, and normally you are. But I think I'd probably slightly draw it back. I mean, to the list that Ben just mentioned, of course you had Modi in India too. You look at the Middle East, etc. We see it everywhere. And the thing that I think is the most troubling question is that although the world has not been without its problems in the last 30 years, particularly Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc., by and large, over the last 30 years, we globally taken, all continents together, shaping it all out. We've all broadly become richer, cleaner, better maternal health care, few infant deaths. It's been pretty...
Not cleaner. That's not what the environmentalists tell us.
Yeah, sorry.
Not
Quite,
cleaner.
quite right.
Yeah.
Sorry, quite right.
Yeah.
But
And that's
in
the
terms-
next thing we should talk about.
Sorry, I mean specifically access to clean drinking water rather than environmentally it's catastrophic, agreed, yes.
Yeah.
But maternal health care, infant mortality, literacy levels, etc. We've all basically had quite a good last 30 years. And for no clear and obvious reason to most of us, we find ourselves at the point where we're really thinking about nuclear missile strikes, not just in Ukraine, but potentially beyond, escalation of China and its US relationship into something regional, potentially global too, and fracture points almost everywhere we look. And it comes as a surprise to most of us. I think, well, why were things going so, what was going so badly wrong that we need to have these knee-jerk reactions? But I mean, to go back to to nudge on what Sebag mentioned about, and Catherine asked about nuclear, I was involved in something called the Integrated Review that came out last year that sort of got missed partly because of lockdowns and the political narrative and so on and so forth. Part of which is about how to blend UK foreign policy, defence and international development into a kind of coherent view, because the challenges this country face, whatever your political persuasion, typically the really big ones are whole of state actors. And one of the parts of the review that I wasn't involved with, which was done by the security services, said that the chances of a chemical, radiological or biological bomb in central London by 2030 is 100%. Right? That was before the invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And part of the problem with this is because we are all detached from reality in the modern world, we can talk about history lulls us into false senses of security. If you underinvest in language learning, if you don't pay attention to what's going on in the real world, and I know that there are some very distinguished Ukrainian politicians and writers in the audience, Ukraine was sold not on the 24th of February, but sold in 2014 when we didn't do anything then. And actually, you could argue that Ukraine was sold in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia. And so when we think about Putin and what's he doing now, all my friends in Russian academia who work on the Middle Ages, or what we historians in Europe call the Middle Ages, all lost their jobs more than 10 years ago. They had proper political interference into who was Anne of Kiev, was Kiev a Ukrainian city, an early Rus city, what are these connections? These go back a long, long, long way. And Putin has been himself talking, he hasn't been writing about them, but has been obsessed about that for a long while. The problem is when you think about history as a kind of patchwork of how did we get there, and suddenly you jolt awake at the wheel, it's absolutely terrifying because you can't understand why we've suddenly got there. So some of it is about, you don't have to use, the title of this panel, history isn't about trying to understand the present or the future, but it is at least should involve some kind of reflection to allow us to think about fundamental things about why do people argue, how do families break down, why are people being excluded from history, why is no one right about sub-Saharan Africa still, why are there so few women in art, how do we correct that? And historians sort of sweep up all that nonsense because they do get engaged. Publishers do bring them in, people do read the books if they get written, people do get funding eventually, we need a lot more of it. But the problem is a structural one, that we're not playing the ball, and probably that's not our fault on the stage. It's deeply embedded in education, it's deeply embedded in funding, and it also is led by the political narrative. We have no bandwidth. In the States, it's the same. Very little bandwidth to think beyond Europe, and suddenly, in fact, we've responded, funnily enough, reasonably well over these last 8 or 9 months with Ukraine. But it's been a cardiac arrest moment for us. Those caught us by surprise economically, politically, socially, and there's going to be more of that to come in the coming months.
And there's a feeling with politicians, it's partly the nature of democracies that obviously they're very short-sighted, and they're always thinking of the next electoral cycle, and when they change government, there's vast inconsistency. So you see that in America, and obviously in England, where the government's changing every couple of weeks at the moment. But more seriously, the worrying thing is that there's, as far as I can see, and Peter knows more about this than I do, but there's very little proper planning for these kind of huge questions, like what happens if people do use nuclear. There's been very little preparation for it, and that is the alarming thing, since these things are going to happen. And it's very like Chekhov said with his plays, if you have the rifle on the wall, sometime in the play,
if you have a gun on the wall,
it's going to be used. It's going to be used.
Just one quick side, and but in 2018, the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee did a report on the role that British legal firms play in laundering Russian money. And I'm not going to name the companies, although it's on public record, but we're stated as being
Feel free.
as representing threats at London-based, UK-owned law firms, which pay their partners whatever, as threats to national security. And you would think at some point, some part of the machine should have kicked in to say, what does that mean? What are the levels of risks that we're at? And, that's a long way back to talking about footsteps in the sand 900,000 years ago. But ultimately, what the point of dynasties, states, relationships, marriages, friendships is to provide stability. That's the whole point of a relationship. So when those break down personally, you get divorced or you split up and you have breakdowns. If you don't get on as a state, if it doesn't work, then you change. The things have to work, and stability is the fundamental thing that families try. Sebag will tell you, because I've read his book, they don't always provide stability. In fact, they're quite often sources of real, as everybody knows at Christmas time.
But I think there's another dimension. I think there's another dimension as well, which is the dimension of stories. We forget the power of stories to demonize, the power of stories to affect the way people think. We know what happened to Carthage with the stories that were told from Rome about the people of Carthage. It's why Nelson Mandela, on the eve of independence, quoted that famous line about Carthage must be destroyed. And the same stories are at work with Ukraine. It's there in Russian literature. It's one of the reasons why Ukrainian writers have an ambivalent feeling towards a writer like Mikhail Bulgakov. Because in his novels, there's been a tremendous demonization of Ukrainians. It's there in Tolstoy.
And in Pushkin.
And in Pushkin. So it runs throughout the literature. So this dimension of the stories that people tell about others, the unchallenged stories that slowly that harden into myth, then harden into forms of response, then harden into policy, then harden into injustice. We're not dealing with that dimension at all because we think that stories are insubstantial things, when in fact, histories and lives and civilizations are driven on a micro and a macro level by stories.
On which note, Sebag, you also talk about the despots of data when we're talking about unchallenged information. You say, we've had democracy, we've had dictatorships, but now we have, technology. We've got surveillance, blockchain, AI, drones, social media.
Yes.
Zuckerberg says, move fast and break things, and we feel like every tech entrepreneur has been handed a sort of path go card on the moral consequences front. So how do we sort of feel about...
Well, yeah, because in the last session with Michael Gove and Lord Roberts of Belgravia, they were talking about the most powerful ever sort of press baron in the Edwardian times, World War I times, Lord Northcliffe, who suddenly owned 40% of the newspapers in the British Empire or in Britain. How much greater now is the power of the great, I call them despots of data, but they're sort of the great tech potentates of Elon Musk or Zuckerberg or whatever. Now, obviously one of the great challenges, we talked about the nuclear challenge, we've talked about climate, we've talked about some of the amazing medical technical advances that have changed life completely and improved it beyond recognition in the last 100 and 200 years, but especially in the last 100 years. But then now we have this new technology that we believed would be an amazing tool for democracy, for the spreading of knowledge, for the opening of societies, and then turned out to be something slightly different. And then, of course, we've discovered that even if it isn't a tool for dictatorship, which, of course, the digital world is, in fact, incredibly useful to surveillance states like China and Russia. But how do we control the data? And how do we control the use of the internet for our children, for ourselves, and for our societies? And that is one of the big challenges that we face now in the 21st century, is how on earth to police that. And that's going to be one of the big challenges next.
Peter, Aindrea, any thoughts on this? Data, dangers?
Well, probably having private individuals who run their own space programs is probably comes with some risks. And in fact, again, those of you who are following Ukraine will know that last week Elon Musk suggested that Ukraine should surrender territory to Russia and should find a way of being neutral, to which the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany tweeted and said, why doesn't Elon Musk, and excuse my language, why don't you just fuck off?
Yeah.
And Elon Musk this morning said, very well, I will fuck off. I'm turning off the Starlink satellite system over Ukraine that provides comms for Ukrainian defense forces. And the truth is, it's not just because he's rich and he's pissed off. Actually, he doesn't want to pay for it because it's going to cost about $400 million next year that SpaceX has to pay, even though almost all of SpaceX's funding comes from the US government. But data is hugely dangerous, and technological monopolies are very dangerous, particularly when they're backed effectively by government money, because it creates dependence, and dependence can tilt very quickly into instability. So My priority, I think, as a historian of the Byzantine Empire, the Mongols and so on, is to look at things that have worked in history. And it's very striking to me that European history tends to be about things that don't work. You know, we focus a lot on Henry VIII and what a bad husband he was, and the First World War, and what happens when states fight each other. And if you know, like the title of this session, what we're going to learn from it, it's how do you make things stick together? You know, how do you make multi-climatic, multi-regional, multilingual European Union types, how do you make them work rather than work out how to do things better? And stability and choosing to be unstable at a time of great volatility is really dangerous. And the data stuff magnifies all of that because, you know, I've been involved in discussions around giving advice to national security stuff around should you allow the sale of small-scale streaming services, because if each of us this evening chooses to listen to a bit of Kenny G in the bath before dinner, or whatever we're listening to, that's geotagged. And everyone knows who's nearby. Your Facebook, even if you're not a Facebook member or an Instagram member, your phone activates your Bluetooth to be scouted by big data companies. And, you know, one of the stories about the pandemic was all of us have smartphones. Most of the world has smartphones, even in low-income countries. In fact, normally more than one, or in many cases more than one. And big tech should have been able to solve that. But the Department of Justice in the US wouldn't give a waiver for tech companies because they were going to harvest so much data about us that they were worried about how that would be used against us. And I think we live in a world that we don't really understand very well. And maybe there are reasons for that because we atomize and we over-specialize. It's quite hard to do really hard to do what Sebag has done, of be detailed, but then take this big bird's eye view. And it's quite tempting, lots of young historians wanting to write histories of the world that take this top-down view. It's really hard to do well because you need to understand the sources and treat them scientifically rather than jump in and out. But I get a real sense that we are, all of us, ever unaware that we suddenly live in a world that we really don't understand very well. And for a historian like me who's been saying that for quite a while, I sort of feel slightly vindicated if anyone wants to buy me a drink afterwards. But there's a real call to arms, I think, that we need to change how we educate, and we need to change, you know, what is it that we think a 16 or an 18-year-old smart and, you know, and kids from all intellectual developments, what is it that they should know? How should they use critical thinking? And that's a real challenge because those things don't fix quickly. You need to, you know, invest in teachers and the syllabus and so on. And can you even do that at a time when we've had 8 ministers of education in the last 7 years? We had 5 this year. You know, we don't have a minister for universities right now. We have somebody who sits on top of it but hasn't been to visit university in the last 3 months since she was appointed. So that doesn't fill people like me with a great deal of hope and expectation. And if you're already scared, then I can make things feel much, much worse. And if you come into the Ukraine discussion tonight, make sure you stock up on the coffee.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we're really running out of time, so I just, in a bid to cheer everybody up, I've just got a sort of jollier question here. Sebag, I know you've spoken to some amazing people over your career and for this book. Boris Berezovsky, Shevardnadze, Margaret Thatcher, Juan Carlos, Shimon Peres, Tim Berners-Lee. I just wanted to ask everybody on this panel, who is the most, you've all met incredible people in your careers, who is the most impressive person you've spoken to?
Oh, I mean, I think
have a
this
top
may be.
three if you want.
I've actually spoken to or met. I mean, I have met. I've been very lucky writing the book. I've met amazing people. I've been very fortunate to talk in the history of the last 50 years to some of these characters, and I know all of the people on this panel have also been consulted and talked to sort of leaders around the world. What's amazing is how unimpressive many of them are, in fact, and how, you know, the most impressive people who actually you meet are kind of, I always find, are actually ordinary people you meet, living in incredibly difficult circumstances. And I just remember one moment. Yes, I did. You know, I did talk to Thatcher as a schoolboy in Downing Street, and I flew around with Shevardnadze, and I had many conversations with Kissinger and Peres, and a few British prime ministers who shall remain nameless in the last 20 years. But, you know, most kind of moving and touching things. I remember when I was a war correspondent. I was in the Ossetian War in 1991. The fall of empire, the fall of the Soviet Empire. And actually, the fall of empires is an amazing opportunity for a historian to see how things really work on the ground. And I think that's part of the training as well. And I remember the whole lot of young people in the village had been killed. And I remember they invited me up to a feast on the top of a mountain. It's the most beautiful place I'd ever seen, the Georgian mountains. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's just so gorgeous and so dazzling and so green. And I was up there, and on the top of this mountain, a white table was laid with a tablecloth, and on it was a Georgian supra, a Georgian feast. And the soldiers laid their rifles against the tree, and we all sat at the table, and somebody stood up and sung on a guitar Suliko, a beautiful Georgian song, and I sort of felt I was in a movie, and I felt that I was living in a theatre rather than reality. And then after all this, and there were many toasts, I said to my host, I said, "And where are the boys who were killed?" And they lifted up the tablecloth, and the bodies were under the table. And I realized that, you know, to write history, you have to feel history as well. And I guess that's the theme of all of us here who are writing, whether we're writing fiction and poetry or history, is, you know, you forget that how real it is. And it's the ordinary people that are really the remarkable ones who survive the follies of politicians. And I guess partly that's the theme of my world history.
Wonderful.
If I was going to choose,
Yes.
I would choose two examples. I would choose again. We're back to Tolstoy. Tolstoy has Napoleon on the one hand, the kings of Russia, the generals, and he chooses as his center of consciousness, of the most illuminating consciousness in the whole novel, a peasant in prison with Pierre, who teaches him about happiness. That's one. The other is my mother, who during the Civil War in Nigeria spent all of her time being hidden under various underground places and always kept her humor. And on the first day that we got freed from it, she told me the story of the tortoise. And that story has affected my aesthetics profoundly ever since. But you'll have to come to one of my own events to get that story.
Amazing. I love the upselling. Andrea?
It's going to sound very corny, but just other historians and artists, because I feel that the way that we see the world is just profoundly interesting. Anything that allows me to challenge how I see myself and everything else, I think is more impressive than most people, really.
Wonderful. Peter?
Well, so it's funny, people who have huge responsibilities, I can't imagine how they sleep at night, you know. So, you know, I know Mike Mullen a little bit, who was the chair of the Joint Chiefs of the previous administration in the United States, who had a budget of $680 billion a year. And how do you try and break that down? And people in that kind of world have to think incredibly carefully around the responsibilities they have. And, you know, all those amazing people I've managed to meet. But I'd like Ben, I'd probably put my wife as number one in terms of the fact, well, first she's in the audience. Second, I know what's good for. But also, you know, I think in terms of stability, in terms of getting on with things and making things work, you know, it's very easy to kind of always look to the top. So, I mean, when you're thinking about it, who's the most impressive, one of our next door neighbours in our village fosters severely disabled kids. And every time we walk past, you know, we sometimes bump into each other walking the dog. And if you ever want to feel uplifted and happy and confident the world is a better place, and apart from the fact you think, what little do I possibly do, writing books, sitting on panels, showing off about who I met. But, you know, the fact most people in this world are really good, kind, generous, trying to help. And the points of communities, of families, and they do go wrong. And Sebag's book's got some fantastic, you know, if you want to know about your Ottoman history and how dangerous it is to have brothers and sisters, you'll get all of that.
Yeah.
But I think it's just that being able to get on with things and to be able to negotiate in difficult situations and to keep smiling. And we do that pretty well in Britain. And it's heartbreaking, I think, to live through what we're going through right now, particularly the chaos behind the scenes. It's not just a shit show. It brings shame on the fact that grown, civilized people who've chosen to be politicians find it's so hard to find a narrative that most of us, we all disagree with each other. I've got lots of people we could kick off about, but to find that very basic decency, to say we're all trying to do the right thing rather than score points. So people who get on with it, teachers, healthcare workers, all the people that are heroes in the pandemic, you know, those are the ones who I admire most and wish I was more like than I am.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Now we're a few minutes into questions, our allotted question time. So let's move on and let me know if anyone wants any questions. Great. Have we got the microphones? Have we got microphones? Okay. Okay. Well, sorry. There's a. Can we go over here? This. It's in this. Okay. Here we are, halfway down, and then we'll go over here. Sound the jacket.
Thanks. That was a riveting panel. First, I don't like being put in the position of defending Elon Musk, but I do feel like you did him an injustice by misquoting him. He did not suggest turning off Starlink. He took what was essentially a charitable initiative and suggested the U.S. federal government start funding it from now on. But my question was...
Is that sorry, exactly why is that problematic?
Why is it problematic that they fund it?
Well, Elon Musk has been funding it until he was told to fuck off, and now is not funding it. Whether he wants the American government to pay for it, whether they should be, my point was that the American government should have their own serviceable satellites, secure comms, and that they don't.
Oh, my
I'm not here to
was,
pick a
my
fight with
point was
Elon
that you
Musk.
misquoted him. He did not suggest turning it off. It is still on, and he is still funding it. So that was inaccurate and a slander against him. My point was that if you've talked a lot about nuclear weapons, by the way, it was a crappy thing of him to suggest that. I'm not suggesting that he was right to, get into it on Twitter. But he talked a lot about nuclear weapons and the possibility, that we're, in a more dangerous place than we, used to be because of them. But is it possible that we're actually safer because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons in terms of their keeping a lid on how hot conflicts can get?
Well,
Anyone?
Well,
Did you-
Well,
Stephen?
yeah, no, it's
Oh,
like
okay.
it's
Where
like
do we
it's like
start?
it's like it's like saying
It's a big
it's like
question.
saying it's like saying if everyone in this room has a gun, we're all safer because we have one. But that's the beginning of mutual mass extermination.
yeah. I
Sebag,
mean, no,
thoughts?
I don't feel at all safer by the thought that nuclear weapons are proliferating, I must say.
Okay, next question. Okay, can we go down the back? Here, we've got 3 questions down this side of the room. Let's go from the front. Okay, right here first, and we'll come to you two in a minute. Okay.
Sebag, you said earlier that democracy has its flaws, and I completely agree with you, especially on the short-termism. Having looked around the world at all the different systems that that the world has had over many centuries, which one would you think is best in terms of stability, in terms of prosperity, and ensuring that there aren't wars and things? And I suppose Peter, in a way, might also.
Well, I think democracy is extremely imperfect. It's got many flaws. I mean, I mentioned the fact that there's great short-termism. It's extremely inconsistent. When a government changes, but that's the whole point. I think there's one of the things I think about, for example, the Brexit debate is, I mean, I was a Remainer, so I don't support Brexit, but attacking the result because one doesn't like it is also, I mean, people vote in democracies. One doesn't always approve of what they vote for, and that's the nature of democracy. I think it's a very imperfect system. It's still the best system, and we're very lucky in this country that we have a democracy. What we're seeing now is the sort of tragic devaluing of that. Democracies work in a certain way, in a certain trust. In America, we're seeing it even more. There needs to be a sort of a trust, a respect for your opponents, which is vanishing. We need to get that back. And partly this is a process. Since 1945, we've existed for sort of 70 years in a world that respects the sort of the values that were won in 1945, and that's broken up, and we need to fight for them all again. And I think that's that's the challenge. That's the greatest challenge of the next 10 years.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think for what it's worth, a lot of the countries I work on are authoritarian and difficult, unpleasant, and worse. It's not been easy, though, in the last year, it's fair to say, when we say we should be more like us in the United Kingdom or more like the United States. It's very hard to sell that. The way in which you can sell it is to say, despite all of this, the show is still on the road. And we can make terrible decisions. It can be bloodbaths and switching chancellors quicker than we can brew the coffee. But on the other hand, there is a functional government, and that doesn't happen in autocratic regimes where decisions get made by one person, and if you make mistakes, you double down. And at least here, there is a way in which we can turn things around. But that is a relatively sophisticated a nuanced way to say it, and let's hope that it's also right. But yeah, I think Simon's exactly right.
I think it also depends on the respect for and the ability to maintain truth in the system. Because the minute truth is devalued, which is what we're going through right now, the lies that we're told about Brexit, the lies on the side of vans and the amount of money we're going to get from the NHS and the lies that's been operated on in America with Trump and black votes and the way in which people are being democratized, that too, it all depends on truth. So I think truth is one of the great casualties of this tragedy of democracy that we're talking about right now.
The truth is a great panacea, but actually this book, I mean, it goes right the way since sort of ancient Greece, and actually politicians have been lying to people all along throughout. I mean, one of the great themes of this book is that politicians are always lying to their people, and it's the people's job to try and sort out it. In a democracy, they have the chance to do that, to try and make evaluations and decide what is true and what isn't. But there's nothing new about that.
Are we supposed to take comfort in that in some way, or not
No
particularly?
comfort,
Right,
but
okay,
we've got to remain. And that's the point. In a search for stability, we have to remain critical of our politicians. And and the great thing about democracies is there is a chance, if you make the wrong decision, to change the government and to change the decision. And that is the prerogative of the people, and that's why we care about democracies.
Not if it takes you to a war that could be terminal.
No, if it's terminal. If it's terminal, there's no second chances.
Okay, I can't bear to end there, so let's have a few more questions before we get to... Okay, can we go down the back, and then we'll come to the front. So to the back row.
Sorry,
Microphone? Can we have a microphone on the back row?
This guy's got it.
Oh, where is it? Sorry, I can't see.
Sorry, the question.
Okay, go for it. Sorry, I didn't realise you'd already got one there.
Yeah,
okay,
thanks.
fabulous. Go on.
One of the interpretation of Tolstoy's view is about uncertainty. So, the deep uncertainty of the world, and he presented it as this idea that you have foxes who think about the world as lots of little facts, but you can never know the whole picture. You always have to accept that it's uncertain. Or you have hedgehogs who have a narrative, and they just bend everything to their narrative, and it speaks to epistemological humility. And how do you think about epistemological humility and what you do? And also, how do we, the hedgehog, the narrative is so attractive to people, but it's often false. So how do we turn people around to kind of...
Are you asking anyone in particular? Or?
Just the whole panel individually.
Okay.
Do you know, how do you bring that epistemological humility into your own
where are you on
work?
that?
I'm not sure what the question is exactly, but I love foxes. So
I love
I think we should just praise foxes and keep going.
Okay,
If we all agree.
great. I think it was
Let's not discount hedgehogs.
I think it was about the fact you can only see, what's right in front of you in a way, but I think the world slightly undermines that argument because it's such a huge...
But seeing what's in front of you is not enough. Sometimes you have to try and see the whole picture.
Yeah,
So I think we need both. It's that's why I love the technique you used in your book.
Well, that's why. But that's also what you're saying. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, because
Keep going.
we need.
Now we're talking.
It's a novelistic technique.
Yes.
To look in great detail, because profound decisions we think are made in sweeping gestures. Actually, they're made in detail. Sometimes they're made in gestures. Sometimes they're made in the most minute dimensions of conversations. So to look at detail is as important as to have a really big. And I think it's one thing that visual arts teach us. I wish you'd spoken a bit more about what art teaches us in terms of the way in which it can, get us to see a hand as well as to see the movement of a whole battlefield.
Sorry, is that a question, or do you want me to just...
Just bringing you in.
No, I mean, that is completely true. And I think, I started to try and touch on that when I was trying to discuss how the book would work as an exhibition or how it wouldn't. But when, as you're saying, the best art does exactly that. It allows us to understand more about the world and also draws us to such minute details that we can understand one person's perspective, and also I guess that does make us feel that sense of humility and that sense of a wider, sort of greater sense of a bigger story that links many different cultures and many different histories together. That's part of that.
I like the word humility, by the way. We need that more in history as well as in all the other sciences.
Okay, we've probably got time for one or two more. Anyone else? Front row, let's go here.
I've got the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Okay, can we have a microphone down the front for the next question? You go, and then can we have a microphone in the front row? Go on, where I can't see you, but
I'm
go
here.
for it.
I'm here. Charlotte, you go.
Oh, hi.
The,
I can't see you. Will you wave at me? I can't
Yeah.
see. Oh, there you are. You're right down there. Okay.
Right down here.
Go on.
So I wanted to ask about the stories that politicians tell their people and that people tell themselves, and how that drives what happens with countries. Essentially, it's about nationalism. So surely governments tell these people the stories that their people want to believe to make themselves feel better about the position they're in. But nationalism is a drug, isn't it? How do you argue with that? You can't tell people that it won't make them richer or it won't make them happier because they don't don't care. It just makes me feel amazing. Isn't that what's the problem? That's what's happening in Russia at the moment. It's happened in so many other countries in Eastern Europe and other places over the years.
Well, you've just put your finger on one of the problems with democracy, which is that the people can feel as a group really good about a certain kind of narrative, and the narrative is false, and yet huge things can be done from that, and votes can be made from that. Hitler was voted into power. We should remember he didn't seize it. It wasn't a coup. So that I think you've put it's a very important point. I wonder how you'd like to respond to that.
I mean, I think that in democracies, people can correct themselves if they go too far. If the mistake is too bad, it's incorrigible, as we saw with Hitler. But perhaps since we're down on that time, we should just end with, when I wrote this book and I looked back over history, there's so much to be depressed about. There's so much that there's nuclear war, there's climate change, there's the tech, there's the mismanagement of politicians, and yet when I look back at throughout the whole of history that is covered in this book, when I look back at the creativity and ingenuity, the sense of purpose, I looked back at the love of families and individuals, I did actually end feeling that somehow human history is encouraging, and we should feel hope and joy and celebrate as well what we've achieved and what we will achieve.
Can we have a couple more while we're at it?
That's it.
Oh,
I'll
that's
keep
it.
going.
No, I thought the girl. I
Okay,
thought
so
the
just
lady in
yeah,
front.
one more here.
Clemmy, go on. One more.
Young people.
Last one.
I think
Last
she's-
Is
one.
there anybody else young who
I
thinks
know.
they're young?
Go on, Clemmy.
Well, Sebag, this is on the same note as what you were just saying. I was just wondering, in your book, if there was any particular family that you really enjoyed or thought did things really well, and were a good model for kind of how it's done.
Sure.
Who thought through things very well. I mean, I loved Ibn Khaldun, the historian of who was born in Tunis, who wrote about history and wrote about the idea of solidarity, Abbasiyya, that keeps together communities. And even though he was writing all those centuries ago in the time of Tamerlane, whom he met, and he was an expert in power. There was, I think, in a sense, he's one of the sort of historians that I write about in the book that I most admire, and whose work is entirely timeless. And in a sense, society has changed so much, but he put his finger on the fact that if we don't work together, if we don't have a feeling of community, if we don't have trust, society doesn't work. And in times of crisis, I believe that will come back. And that's why I ended the book in an optimistic way. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, illustrious panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing? It's a wonderful book. Everybody must go and buy a copy, and Sebag is now going to go to the bookshop and sign them. And there's they are available in the bookshop. Yes. So please, can we go in there?